Good evening. I'm Dick Clay. I'm the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the Gertrude Polk Brown lecture series featuring author James Oakes and his book, The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln and the Anti-Slavery Constitution. Initiated in 1993 as a memorial to the life of Gertrude Polk Brown, and made possible by the continuous generous support of her daughter, Dace Brown Stubbs, and her grandchildren, Marshall Farrer and Dace Polk Brown, her daughter, Laura Lee Brown, and her grandchildren, Garvin Dieters, Polk Dieters, and Laura Lee Gastus, and her grandsons, G. Garvin Brown IV and Campbell P. Brown. The series has brought internationally recognized historians to Louisville. More than 38,500 citizens have learned more about the significant stories of our region, our nation, and world because of the Gertrude Polk Brown lectures. The Filson is extraordinarily grateful for this generosity. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce James Oakes as our Gertrude Polk Brown lecturer. He is one of the leading historians of 19th century America. He has an international reputation for path-breaking scholarship. In a series of influential books and essays, he tackled the history of the United States from the Revolution through the Civil War. His early work focused on the South, examining slavery as an economic and social system that shaped Southern life. His pioneering books include The Ruling Race, which was written in 1982, Slavery and Freedom, an Interpretation of the Old South, which was authored in 1990, The Radical and the Republican, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and the Triumph of Anti-Slavery Politics, which he wrote in 2007. And then his latest, one of his latest, Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, which he wrote in 2012. The latter two garnered respectively the 2008 and 2013 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, which is an annual award for the finest scholarly work in English on Abraham Lincoln or the American Civil War era. His most recent book, which I have here, is The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln and the Anti-Slavery Constitution. It was published by W.W. Norton in January of 2021. Dr. Oakes is an alumnus of Baruch College, and he holds his MA and his PhD degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. He has been on the faculty of the Graduate Center at the City University of New York since 1997, and the holder of its Graduate School Humanities chairmanship since 1998. Before coming to CUNY, he taught at Princeton and at Northwestern universities. And now, without any further talk from me, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. James Oakes on Abraham Lincoln, The Crooked Path to Abolition. Dr. Oakes.
Thank you, Dick, for that generous introduction, and let me express my regret that I'm not able to be there this evening in person. I was looking forward to meeting you folks in person, and also because I was hoping for a bit of a return to normalcy, but I guess we've all gotten used to these Zoom type meetings, and I hope you find this rewarding, even if it isn't in the venue I would have, and I'm sure you would have heard. In the summer of 1854, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society sent out word of a large gathering to be held at Harmony Grove in Framingham, 16 miles from Boston, on the 4th of July. For 50 cents, picnickers were offered special trains to and from the grounds. Handbills blared out the theme of the meeting, "No Slavery," and promised addresses by eminent speakers, among them Sojourner Truth and Henry David Thoreau. But the speech that attracted the most attention and left the most lasting impression was delivered by the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Much of what Garrison had to say that day was familiar to all opponents of slavery. July 4th is, of course, the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And even the most mainstream of mainstream anti-slavery politicians would have nodded in agreement as Garrison insisted that the famous phrase, "all men are created equal," meant that every human being was equally entitled to their freedom, and that slavery was a violation of that sacred principle. When Garrison held up a copy of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and set it on fire, those same mainstream politicians might have winced, but they would not have disagreed with the sentiment. They all hated the law. Some wanted it revised, some thought it should be repealed outright, and some thought the law was unconstitutional. And that's where most anti-slavery folks parted company with Garrison. He didn't think the fugitive slave law was unconstitutional. He thought the law was perfectly consistent with the Constitution. He felt the same way about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed a few months earlier, which reopened the Nebraska Territory to slavery. And he felt the same way about the rendition of Anthony Burns, a fugitive slave who had recently been marched through the streets of Boston by federal troops, returning him to slavery in the face of 50,000 protesters. Most of slavery's opponents thought the Kansas-Nebraska Act was inconsistent with the Constitution. Most believed that Anthony Burns had been deprived of his constitutional rights. But not William Lloyd Garrison. None of the recent victories of the so-called slave power, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Nebraska Act, the rendition of Anthony Burns, none of these were violations of the Constitution, Garrison insisted. If anything, they were caused by the Constitution. The source and parent of all the other atrocities, Garrison declared that day, was the Constitution itself, which he then denounced as, quote, "a covenant with death and an agreement with hell." Striking another match, Garrison held up a copy of the US Constitution and set it to flames as well. With that, at least part of the crowd turned against Garrison as hisses and boos welled up from the audience. Nowadays, scholars and journalists tend to agree with Garrison's denunciation of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, and it's not hard to see why. The Constitution contains several clauses that protected slavery. There was the Fugitive Slave Clause, which gave slaveholders a constitutional right to enter into free states and capture their escaped slaves. There was the notorious 3/5 Clause, which enhanced the power of the slave states in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. The biggest problem was federalism. Everyone agreed that slavery was a state institution and that the Constitution did not allow the federal government to abolish slavery in a state where it was legal. And so for these and other reasons, Garrison denounced the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. We need to take seriously the boos and hisses that rang out from Garrison's anti-slavery audience. For at the moment he torched the Constitution, most abolitionists and virtually all anti-slavery politicians disagreed with him, including Abraham Lincoln. He and they believed that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document. They had a saying, within the Constitution, freedom is the rule, slavery is the exception. What did that mean? It meant that the founders had produced a Constitution that overwhelmingly favored freedom, but which, in order to create a unified new nation, made a couple of deplorable but alas necessary exceptions, notably the 3/5 and fugitive slave clauses. But again, they were exceptions in a Constitution that as a general rule, favored freedom over slavery. This evening, I want to reconstruct that anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution Lincoln believed in, and which profoundly shaped his approach to slavery and to racial equality while he was president during the Civil War. But for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm not going to mention Lincoln at all. Instead, repeat, I'm going to run quickly through the history of anti-slavery constitutionalism as it developed before Lincoln made anti-slavery the centerpiece of his own politics, which didn't happen until 1854. So, the anti-slavery Constitution. In 1776, when Americans declared their independence from Great Britain, there was no need for compromise between slave and free states because there were no free states. 13 slave colonies had declared their independence and become 13 slave states. By 1787, however, things had changed dramatically. Inspired by the Revolution, northern states had begun to abolish slavery. Vermont's Constitution did so in 1777. The Pennsylvania legislature passed a gradual abolition statute in 1780. Massachusetts courts abolished slavery a few years later, as did the legislatures in the remaining New England states. Both houses of the New York legislature voted to abolish slavery as well. As a result, at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, pro-slavery and anti-slavery delegates encountered one another, argued with one another, and if they were to reach an agreement on the new Constitution, they would have to compromise. That, notoriously, is what the founders did. The result of those compromises was a document that included both pro-slavery and anti-slavery clauses. The slaveholders secured the protections denounced by Garrison, the 3/5 and fugitive slave clauses, but the opponents of slavery secured the authorization for the federal government to ban the importation of African slaves beginning in 1808, first such authorization in history. And the Constitution gave Congress the power to ban slavery from U.S. territories. The delegates from the Deep South states tried to secure a constitutional recognition of a right of property in their slaves, but they were thwarted by anti-slavery delegates. As a result, the Constitution refers to slaves as persons, not as property. And there was federalism, what scholars call the federal consensus, the near universal agreement that slavery was strictly a state institution. This was by far the most significant constitutional restraint on anti-slavery politics. For although the federal consensus meant that Congress could not interfere with abolition in a state, it also meant that Congress could not interfere with, that is, abolish slavery in a state. It should be obvious that a constitution that had both pro-slavery and anti-slavery elements would lead inexorably, if not inevitably, to competing interpretations of the document and to conflict over what power the federal government had over slavery, short of outright abolition in the states. This was more than a theoretical possibility. In a very real sense, in the actual history of the United States, when it came to slavery, there were two constitutions. There was a pro-slavery constitution, the one that Garrison burned and that John C. Calhoun defended, and there was an anti-slavery constitution, the one Lincoln and the Republican Party subscribed to. Over the course of 7 decades of acrimonious debate over slavery, both sides elaborated on their own incompatible understandings of the Constitution. In those decades, between 1790 and 1860, the opponents of slavery proved to be particularly good at colonizing more and more parts of the Constitution for anti-slavery purposes. Of course, they invoked Congress's power to ban the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808 as soon as the Constitution allowed it. Anti-slavery congressmen likewise invoked their power to make all needful rules and regulations for the territories, including banning slavery. But they also cited the Republican Government Clause, which they believed gave Congress the right to require a new state to abolish slavery as a condition for admission to the Union. The Exclusive Legislation Clause, they said, gave Congress the power to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. The Interstate Commerce Clause allowed Congress to regulate the interstate slave trade. And what about the Fifth Amendment? Does it not state emphatically that no person can be deprived of liberty without due process of law? And doesn't that mean that the Fugitive Slave Clause could not be enforced in disregard of the accused fugitives' rights of habeas corpus and trial by jury, rights Southerners insisted slaves could not possibly have because slaves were property, not persons? For the same reason, the slaveholders blanched when opponents of slavery tried to inhibit fugitive slave renditions by invoking the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable seizures. Then, too, there was the 10th Amendment, which reserved to the states all powers not specifically delegated to the federal government. Was the power to establish slavery in the territories delegated to Congress? No, said anti-slavery Northerners. Indeed, the 10th Amendment deprived Congress of the power to allow slavery anywhere the federal government was sovereign. As the Free Soilers put it in 1848, Congress can no more make a slave than a king. Of the various aspects of the Constitution invoked by slavery's opponents, the most important by far, the one that determined the fate of all the others, was the reference to slaves as persons rather than property. Property question was the linchpin of the slavery debate. Defenders of slavery insisted that the Constitution recognized and protected slaves as property. Opponents of slavery flatly denied that the Constitution recognized a right of what was called property in man. From those two contradictory readings of the text, significant conclusions about slavery followed. Beyond the text, there was the spirit of the Constitution. As early as 1820, politicians claimed that fundamental human equality was the guiding principle of the Constitution. Not only does the Fifth Amendment declare that every person was presumptively entitled to life, liberty, and property, the preamble explicitly declares that the very purpose of government is to secure the blessings of liberty to everyone. From a constitution they believed made only a couple of concessions to slavery, but was on balance overwhelmingly anti-slavery in both text and spirit, opponents of slavery derived the popular aphorism I mentioned earlier: the Constitution made freedom the rule and slavery the exception. All of which raised the question: if the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, but Congress could not abolish slavery in a state where it was legal, what could Congress do? What kind of anti-slavery politics was possible? As it turned out, the question broke down into two separate ones. What could the federal government do about slavery in peacetime, and what could it do about slavery in wartime? And answering those questions, the opponents of slavery developed what I call the anti-slavery project. In times of peace, the federal government could suppress the Atlantic slave trade, prosecute slave smugglers, regulate the domestic slave trade, recognize the natural right of freedom of slaves who rebelled on ships plying the open seas, ban slavery from all U.S. territory, deny admission of many new slave states into the Union, abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., and inhibit fugitive slave renditions by protecting the due process rights of accused fugitives. If the federal government did all these things, it would effectively surround the slave South with and the slave states with free oceans, free territories, and genuinely free soil. The anti-slavery project would thereby constrict the South within what was known as a cordon of freedom, slowly strangling slavery and eventually forcing the states to abolish slavery on their own, or as Lincoln said, putting slavery on a course of ultimate extinction. This point cannot be emphasized strongly enough. The goal of the anti-slavery project was to cripple slavery by thwarting its need to keep expanding, weakening it internally to the point where the southern states, following the lead of the northern states, eventually abolished slavery on their own. Would the anti-slavery project have worked without a war? Skeptics have raised this counterfactual question as though the answer were obviously no, but serious scholars have argued that the slave economy could not survive if it could not expand, and the project of halting its expansion amounted to a slow sentence of death for slavery. We are dazzled sometimes, perhaps we should say we are horrified, by the rapid growth and profitability of King Cotton in the first half of the 19th century. But that wealth and that growth has diverted our attention from the fact that the Southern economy was in relative decline within the larger US economy and had been since the early 19th century. If there had been no war, that relative decline would have accelerated as the cotton market stagnated and Northern industrialization took off. Moreover, the relative decline of Southern economic power was accompanied by a decline in Southern political power, a trend that would have accelerated in the absence of a civil war. Anti-slavery Northerners and pro-slavery Southerners were well aware of these trends, and for that reason, they concluded that halting slavery's expansion was indeed a death sentence for the institution. We can never know whether the anti-slavery project would have worked if there was no war, but we can say with some certainty that in thinking so, Lincoln and the Republicans were not merely delusional. There is, of course, another counterfactual question that skeptics have not considered. Would the war have resulted in the destruction of slavery without the anti-slavery project? And the answer to that, I believe, is a resounding no. Throughout history, wars have more often led to mass enslavement than to mass emancipation. Most armies have behaved like the Confederate Army when it invaded Pennsylvania and rounded up black people and carried them into the South into slavery. Union Army behaved differently because the Union Army was told to behave differently. Federal troops could be ordered to emancipate because in wartime, the opponents of slavery argued that the Constitution gave the federal government still more ways of attacking slavery. Ever since the American Revolution, the consensus among American statesmen was that belligerents could rightfully emancipate enemy slaves in an effort to win a war or suppress an insurrection. A later generation of abolitionists formulated a forfeiture of rights doctrine. In an influential pamphlet he published in 1837, William Jay responded to repeated Southern threats of secession by warning that if a state seceded from the Union, it would automatically forfeit its claim to any constitutional protection of slavery. The states remaining in the Union would thus be freed of any obligation to return fugitive slaves or to suppress a slave insurrection or any form of insurrection in the Southern states. Thus, secession and war strengthened the anti-slavery Constitution, substantially enhancing the power of the federal government to undermine slavery. Such was the anti-slavery Constitution as it had evolved by the time Abraham Lincoln entered politics in the 1830s, and evolved still further by the time he took up anti-slavery as the central theme of his politics in the 1850s. This is not to say that Lincoln suddenly became hostile to slavery in 1854. He had always hated slavery, he once said. He could not remember a time when he did not feel that way. He had entered politics as a Whig, a Northern Whig, and that meant that although his primary interests lay elsewhere, he did over time endorse various elements of the anti-slavery project. Hardly a surprise, since the Northern Whigs were overwhelmingly anti-slavery. And so in the 1830s, while still in the Illinois state legislature, Lincoln publicly denounced slavery as an injustice and declared that, contrary to what pro-slavery Southerners were saying, Congress could, under the Constitution, abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. In the 1840s, during his single term in the House of Representatives, Lincoln drafted a bill to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. Moreover, he had entered Congress at the very moment it had become bitterly divided over the disposition of the territory recently taken from Mexico. Northerners overwhelmingly demanded that slavery be banned from the newly acquired territory, and Lincoln voted repeatedly to support the ban. When the Whig Party collapsed in the 1850s, it was a logical move for Lincoln to join the new anti-slavery Republican Party. In 1854, he redefined himself as an anti-slavery politician whose principles were grounded in the anti-slavery Constitution. He began, hesitantly at first, to advocate due process rights for accused fugitives. He called repeatedly for the suppression of the illegal Atlantic slave trade at a time when the illegal trade was expanding in places like New York. He invoked the forfeiture of rights doctrine, warning Southerners that if they seceded from the Union, their slaves, quote, now only partially returned, will not be returned at all. For Lincoln, as for abolitionists and Republicans alike, the principle of fundamental human equality, including the universal right to freedom, was the guiding spirit of the Constitution. He once likened the Declaration of Independence to a picture, the Constitution to its frame. This put Lincoln in direct opposition to Northern Democrats like Stephen Douglas, who read the Declaration to mean that only white men were created equal, and to pro-slavery Southerners like John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis, who argued that only states were created equal. For Lincoln, all men are created equal meant everyone, men and women, black and white. If the Negro is a man, he said, my ancient faith tells me that all men are created equal. Although Lincoln always hated slavery, he had never been much of a racial egalitarian, but as his commitment to anti-slavery constitutionalism intensified, as the principle of fundamental human equality seeped into his anti-slavery speeches, his views on race shifted subtly in a more egalitarian direction. If the spirit of the Constitution was anti-slavery, so was the text. And here Lincoln's confrontation with the pro-slavery Constitution was direct and unambiguous. Over the decades, as Northern activists, writers, and politicians steadily developed the anti-slavery Constitution, Southerners had been responding in kind with an increasingly radical interpretation of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. And again, the linchpin of that debate was the right of property. The pro-slavery reading, slave ownership was expressly protected by the Constitution as a right of property. Consequently, Congress could not abolish slavery in DC because it would violate the slaveholders' rights of property. Congress likewise had no power to ban slavery in the territories. Indeed, precisely because slaves were property, the Constitution obliged Congress to protect slavery in the territories. Fugitive slaves were not entitled to due process rights because the slaves were property. Moreover, slavery in the United States was restricted to Black people, and Black people, according to the Supreme Court, had no rights a white man was bound to respect, including, of course, the rights of due process. For an anti-slavery politician like Abraham Lincoln, it was the property argument that had to be confronted. This was what Lincoln did most systematically and most forcefully in his famous speech at the Cooper Institute in Lower Manhattan. Early 1860, an election year. Lincoln had caught the fever of presidential ambition and went to New York to establish his ideological bona fides with Eastern Republicans, many of whom were hostile to the Republican frontrunner, William Seward, and were therefore anxious to have a look at this increasingly attractive alternative from Illinois. Lincoln's theme at Cooper Institute was the relationship between slavery and the Constitution in both specific policy terms and ultimately in broad legal terms. The policy question was straightforward. Does the Constitution empower the federal government to ban slavery from the territories? Yes, Lincoln said, that is what the Constitution allows, and that is what the framers clearly intended. By Lincoln's count, 23 of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention also voted in Congress on various measures to ban slavery from the territories. And of those 23, 21 supported the ban. So the framers supported the policy of banning slavery in the territories. Then Lincoln shifted to the most important constitutional issue at stake. Southerners were wrong to demand aggressive federal protections of slavery, Lincoln said, for when you make such demands, quote, you have a specific and well understood allusion to an assumed constitutional right of yours to take slaves into the federal territories and to hold them there as property. But no such right is specifically written into the Constitution. That instrument is literally silent about any such right. We, on the contrary, deny that any such right has any existence in the Constitution, even by implication. Not only did the Constitution not recognize the right of property in slaves, Lincoln pointed out, on the contrary, wherever in that instrument the slave is alluded to, he is called a person, never property. Perhaps paraphrasing James Madison, Lincoln concluded that this mode of alluding to slaves and slavery was employed on purpose to exclude from the Constitution the idea that there could be property in man. This was 6 years after William Lloyd Garrison gave his famous speech denouncing the Constitution and setting it on fire. But as I've tried to make clear, virtually all anti-slavery politicians, including Lincoln, disagreed with Garrison, as did the majority of abolitionists. If anything, abolitionists were moving in the opposite direction, toward the claim that the Constitution was not simply an anti-slavery document, it was an abolitionist document, that it did, after all, allow Congress to abolish slavery in a state. This abolitionist interpretation was made with particular force by Frederick Douglass in a speech he gave in Glasgow a month after Lincoln spoke at the Cooper Institute. Year after that, having won the presidency, Lincoln gave another speech, his first inaugural address, in which he issued his warning that if the slave states persisted in their rebellion, the slaves, now only partially returned, would not be returned at all. It was not the first time Lincoln issued the threat. The speech he gave at Cincinnati in 1859, Lincoln had warned that with secession, fugitive slaves would not be returned, so it's not surprising that at the very moment he became president, Lincoln threatened to override the fugitive slave clause. Lincoln made good on his threat within weeks of the outbreak of the war by endorsing the action of U.S. Army generals who refused to return what they called contraband slaves to their owners. On July 8th, in a conversation with Senator Orville Browning about fugitive slaves, Lincoln agreed that, quote, the government neither should nor would send back to bondage such as came into our armies. A month later, after Congress authorized the permanent forfeiture of contrabands, Lincoln acted on his constitutional powers as commander-in-chief to emancipate contrabands on the grounds of military necessity. In the year and a half before Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, thousands upon thousands of enslaved people were emancipated as they came into Union lines in Northern Virginia, on the Sea Islands off South Carolina and Georgia, on the peninsula, in Western Missouri, in Arkansas, even in Washington, D.C. This was the wartime anti-slavery Constitution in practice at a very early stage. And from those beginnings, Lincoln's anti-slavery policy became steadily more radical. But remember, the goal of anti-slavery constitutionalism had never been to provoke a war and emancipate slaves as a military necessity. The goal of the anti-slavery project was to pressure the slave states into abolishing slavery on their own. To that end, Lincoln in late 1861 drafted an abolition statute that was a model for the 4 slave states that had remained in the Union. The first half of 1862, he signed off on a raft of congressional bills that implemented the anti-slavery project. Those laws made it a crime for anyone in the U.S. military to participate in the capture and return of fugitive slaves, abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., required West Virginia to abolish slavery as a condition for admission to the Union, and banned slavery from the Western Territory. In his first year as president, Lincoln negotiated a treaty with Great Britain that led within a few years to the end of the 350-year-old Atlantic slave trade. They were building the cordon of freedom. As the crisis moved into its second year, federal anti-slavery policy became more and more aggressive until, with the Emancipation Proclamation, war became revolution. In the early months of 1862, Lincoln had begun to warn loyal border states that emancipation would soon lead to abolition. The famous proclamation of January 1st, 1863, declared emancipation universal in all the disloyal parts of the South. And in the middle of that year, Lincoln began using emancipation to weaken slavery in all of the southern states until one by one, they began to abolish slavery on their own. This was the original goal of the abolitionists, federal encouragement of state abolition, a goal now radicalized by the war. In the last year of the war, 6 slave states, under direct pressure from Lincoln, abolished slavery on their own. Arkansas was first, followed by Maryland, Louisiana, Virginia, Missouri, and Tennessee. The effect was dramatic. When Lincoln was elected president, there were 15 slave and 18 free states in the Union. That proportion made it inconceivable that an abolition amendment could ever be ratified by the necessary 3/4 of the states. By the end of January 1865, 3 new free states had been added to the Union: Kansas, West Virginia, and Nevada. And together with the 6 slave states that abolished slavery, the proportion had changed dramatically. And so on the day that Congress sent the 13th Amendment to the states for ratification, there were 27 free states and 9 slave states. That's 27 out of 36, or 3/4 the number needed for ratification. None of that would have been possible without the policies, the peacetime and wartime policies, sanctioned by the anti-slavery Constitution. And yet this was clearly a paradoxical conclusion, for it revealed both the profound influence, even the necessity, of anti-slavery constitutionalism, while at the same time exposing its serious limitations. Federalism, federal consensus, had always been the most powerful constraint on anti-slavery politics. And by the last year of the war, it had become clear that a constitutional amendment was necessary to overcome that constraint. It turned out that the anti-slavery Constitution was necessary but not sufficient to abolish slavery. Lincoln detected the hand of Providence at work in this outcome, and abolitionists were inspired when, in his inaugural address, he deemed the abolition of slavery a result so fundamental and astounding as to suggest the righteous judgment of the Lord. I have no special insight into the workings of divine providence, but I would suggest that whatever role the Almighty played in the destruction of slavery, it nevertheless required the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, and there was nothing at all inevitable about that. If Lincoln had lost, it almost certainly would have meant that Republicans would not have secured enough votes in the House of Representatives to overcome Democratic opposition to the 13th Amendment. President-elect George McClellan would not have lobbied as Lincoln did to secure the necessary votes in the House, and as president, McClellan would not have demanded abolition as the price of peace. Only with Lincoln's victory and the victory of the Republican Party is it possible to view the abolition of slavery as inevitable. No one understood this better than William Lloyd Garrison. No presidential election has ever occurred at all comparable in magnitude, solemnity, and far-reaching consequences, Garrison wrote as the results of the 1864 election came in. With Lincoln's victory secured, Garrison declared, the doom of rebellion and slavery is now irrevocably pronounced. There's that cautionary tale here, however. Remember, if Lincoln had not won in November of 1864, if slavery had survived a Union victory, it follows that nothing that happened up to that point signaled the inevitable destruction of slavery. Any argument that so much as hints at slavery's inevitable demise should automatically raise suspicion. For example, an intellectual historian could make the abolition of slavery seem foreordained, a kind of fulfillment of the American Revolution's promise of universal freedom, simply by tracing an unbroken line from the founders to the 13th Amendment. 1784, for example, Thomas Jefferson had proposed a land ordinance that would have banned slavery from all the Western territories before they became states. There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in any of the said states, Jefferson's bill declared, otherwise than as punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Clear majorities in the Confederation Congress supported the bill, but the supermajority requirements of the Articles of Confederation prevented passage. 3 years later, however, Congress passed the Ordinance of 1787, banning slavery in all the Northwest territories. Jefferson's language survived nearly intact. There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory otherwise than as punishment for crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. This Northwest Ordinance was reenacted in 1789 by the first Congress operating under the new Constitution, and thereafter it became a touchstone for later opponents of slavery. In 1846, for example, Northern Congressman David Wilmot urged banning slavery from all the territory recently taken from Mexico. His famous proviso declared that, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the said territory, except for crime whereof the party shall have first been duly convicted. From there, the language made its way into the Constitution via the 13th Amendment, which reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. There you have it. Perfectly straight line from Jefferson to the Confederation Congress to the US Congress to the Wilmot Proviso to the 13th Amendment. There are other ways of making the abolition of slavery seem almost inevitable. Overly enthusiastic admirers of Abraham Lincoln sometimes suggest that he was destined all along to free the slaves. Overly enthusiastic social historians sometimes make it seem as though the slaves themselves made abolition inevitable. By the time Lincoln finally got around to issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, one distinguished historian declared, no force on earth could have halted the revolution begun by the slaves themselves. But there were plenty of earthly forces that could have halted the revolution. Lincoln was not destined to become a great emancipator, and intellectual history can create the illusion of a straight path from 1784 to 1865, when in fact, the path to abolition was never straight. If the slave states had kept their wits about them and remained in the Union, the Republicans would not have controlled both houses of Congress and passed all those anti-slavery statutes. There would have been no war and no emancipation as a military necessity. The fact that there was a war was not enough, because abolition had to happen. Because for abolition to happen, the Union had to win the war, and that was not a sure thing. Lincoln and the Republicans, as I said, had to win the 1864 elections, and that wasn't certain either. It was predictable enough that Republicans would admit 3 new free states to the Union, but what are we to make of those 6 southern states that did abolish slavery? The truth is, like the lineage of the British royal family, those state abolitions will not bear too much looking into. Did a handful of counties around Washington, D.C. really count as the loyal state of Virginia? Same question holds for the handful of parishes around New Orleans that were counted as the loyal state of Louisiana. To say that the state of Tennessee abolished slavery is something of a stretch. Maryland would not have abolished slavery if Lincoln had not allowed soldiers to vote, a process that was marked by a number of what are euphemistically termed irregularities. And even though every one of those states ratified the 13th Amendment, a couple of northern states refused to secure the final ratification in late 1865. It took, of all things, an incorrigibly racist president, Andrew Johnson, to force a couple of incorrigibly pro-slavery states, South Carolina and Mississippi. Was indeed a very crooked path to abolition. And yet, yet could not have happened without the anti-slavery project, without the peacetime project or of federal pressure on the southern states to abolish slavery, in concert with the wartime project of confiscation, emancipation, and the enlistment of Black troops. Both projects justified by a constitution that Lincoln believed made freedom the rule and slavery the exception. Take that away, and there is no 13th Amendment. So we are left to ponder one of the great paradoxes of American legal history. It took an anti-slavery constitution to produce an anti-slavery constitution. Thank you.
Dr. Oakes, thank you. This was just an exceptional talk.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. And it's triggered some questions. And so I'm just going to launch in with you. There are two marvelous ones from George Maley. The first one, Dr. Oakes, you pose, and pardon me, everybody, I have to put my trifocals on for these. You pose the question both tonight and in your fine book regarding the natural death of slavery without war as a result of the anti-slavery project. The answer, I'm afraid, is rather clear. All we need to do is look at Jim Crow to see that the South, including Kentucky, was not the least bit interested in freeing Blacks from the chains of bondage. What is your response to that?
To the counterfactual question, the only intellectually respectable answer to the question of what would have happened if there hadn't been a civil war is, I don't know. I think he's right to point out that the Southerners were not at all inclined to abolish slavery on their own at the point that the Civil War erupted. But there have been a number of historians who have argued that to have closed off the South to expansion would have created a serious economic crisis in the South. We know that the cotton economy stagnated at the very moment that industrialization was taking off. We know that the Southern economy had been declining relative to the Northern economy since 1800, and that decline would have dramatically accelerated after 1860 without a civil war. And that relative economic decline in the South had resulted in the political decline of the South in the federal government. It's what caused all the trouble in the 1850s, right? You can think of all the things slave states tried to do and failed to get, or they tried to prevent California from being admitted to the Union, but failed. After that, they tried to have California split in half so that the southern half would be a slave state. They failed. They tried to get a southern route to the Pacific coast because they wanted access to the Pacific markets. They failed. They got a Kansas-Nebraska Act, but they failed to get Kansas admitted as a slave state. They got a Dred Scott decision, but they couldn't get the Northerners to abide by it. And when the Republicans took control of Congress in 1860, they flatly repudiated it. They got a Fugitive Slave Act, but they couldn't enforce it, right? So they were losing power. They had a lot of power, but they were losing it. And the question becomes whether or not the collapse of the slave economy, the collapse of the cotton economy, would have led the slave states to do what the northern states did. And I don't think the answer to that is very clear. I don't think that what would have happened would have been the abolition of slavery and the admission of Southern Blacks into full and equal, participation as citizens of the southern states. But it's not entirely inconceivable that some alternative form of oppression, like sharecropping or tenancy, could have displaced slavery, and that's basically the argument that's made. I honestly don't know how to answer that question. What would have happened?
Here's his second question. It's not intended to stump you.
Right.
All right. In reading your wonderful book and having just finished Charles A. Dana's War Remembrances, I'm struck by the realism of Lincoln. He is neither the holographic God made flesh descending from Olympus, nor the bumbling incompetent who stumbled into the presidency from the backwoods as portrayed by the Lost Cause devotees. I would like you to comment on your personal vision of Lincoln and how it colored your research and your final work?
First, let me reverse the implications of that question. It was the research as my work that colors my interpretation of Lincoln. The thing, I think the questioner is absolutely right. I think Lincoln was neither, the great emancipator who freed all the slaves with the stroke of his pen, nor was he the tyrant who brought the innocent Southerners to heel. He was a politician, and he was a very good politician. And what has always struck me about Lincoln is how effective he was as a politician in negotiating the more radical members of his own party who wanted him to go faster, and at the same time needed to hold on to the Democrats who were willing to fight a war to restore the Union, but were not willing to fight a war to emancipate the slaves. He negotiated that contest between that tug of war between two different important constituencies very, very effectively. And I think we underestimate sometimes his commitment to the ultimate extinction of slavery, and at the same time, his need to maybe go slower than he might have gone, and some wanted him to go, maybe pull back a little more than the radicals wanted him to go, but all with the goal, all with the ultimate result that slavery did get abolished.
Another question from Larry Sloan. Is a constitutional convention, however unlikely, the only way we can, quote, fix, end quote, our Constitution? I believe France has completely rewritten their Constitution multiple times. I also believe I've read some of our so-called founding fathers believe that completely new constitutions should be regularly written. How likely is it that we would ever see this happen? And if so, why?
Well, that's a question for a political scientist or a constitutional law professor more than a historian like myself. But we have never had a constitutional convention outside of the original constitutional convention. I don't know. It doesn't seem to me that we're likely to have one. It seems to me that I just don't know. I just don't know the answer to that question. It was Jefferson did say that constitutions should be rewritten every 20 years or so, but I'm not sure that's the way most of the founders felt. Most of them thought they were creating something more like perpetual union.
Yeah.
Madison seemed
explains the need for amendments.
Yeah, we have an amending process, and obviously we've changed the Constitution many, many different times in many different ways. Right from the start, we changed by adding 10 amendments. But I don't know. A constitutional convention doesn't seem in the offing, but who knows? Stranger things have happened.
Here's one from Judith Bloor. Were there pro-anti-slavery cases that the Supreme Court was hearing during this time? If so, what were the outcomes and how did those inform Lincoln and other politicians? I guess Dred Scott, obviously.
Well, Dred Scott is the obvious one. There had been several cases before then. There was a case coming through the courts that was going to be decided by the Supreme Court, the Lemon case, that could well have disallowed all of the northern state laws that automatically emancipated slaves that were brought voluntarily into the northern states by their owners. Northern states had over the years passed a series of what is called sojourn laws that said that you can't just voluntarily bring a slave into a northern state because northern states are free soil. The moment you set foot on free soil, you are presumptively free. And if you choose not to return with your master, you are free. That was Dred Scott's claim. It looked like the Supreme Court might be heading for a decision that would have disallowed all of those laws. And if they did so, it would have meant that, who knows, it would have meant that the slaveholder could travel to a northern state for a year with his slave, and there was nothing the state could do about it. This is why Lincoln warned that the logic of the Dred Scott decision, the logic of the pro-slavery constitutional argument, that slavery is a constitutionally protected right of property, the logic suggests that, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing.
That's all right. Just don't pick it up. Keep going.
Well, the logic suggests that if it's a constitutionally protected right of property, then it must be protected not only in the territories, but the next step is to protect it in a state, because a state can't override a constitutionally protected right. So that case was coming through the courts, and that's what Lincoln was worried about when he warned of the possibility that this is where the logic of Dred Scott was taking us.
One last question, and a short one. I assume that you participate in these annual or semi-annual presidential rankings that we see. Mm-hmm. Where do you rate Lincoln?
Up at the top.
Want to go further than that? Would you put him number one?
Yeah, yeah, up at the top.
Fair enough. Hey, thank you so much. And everybody, thank you all this evening for being part of this extraordinary, thought-provoking presentation by one of the nation's foremost 19th century Lincoln abolitionist scholars. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You bet.
It's been a pleasure.
Come back, and hopefully come back to us live and in person next book.
Look forward to it.
Okay.
All right.
Bye, everybody.